Hello, everyone, and welcome to an early edition of Beltline to Broadway. It's one of those crazy days that I overbooked once again, but I'm here with Nate McGaha from Arts North Carolina, and we are touching base. I told Nate before we went on air that we could really talk about the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant pretty much every week at this point because there's something ever changing with this news. But we're going to try to catch you up and get you up to speed. And of course, if you have any comments or questions, put them in the chat, and either Nate will try to answer them or he'll know the person or the organization that can answer those questions. So just to backtrack and bring people who may have been living under a rock up to speed, back in December, Congress passed this $2.3 trillion spending bill that included $900 billion in pandemic relief. For a while, we knew that as Save Our Stages, and that hashtag was everywhere. And those monies were going to be distributed by the Small Business Association, and applications were going to open April 8th. And I wish I could say, and then they all lived happily ever after. But no, alas, there have been changes and glitches since you and I've spoken last, which is why I wanted to catch back up with you. The first change was the name. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but we spoke about Save Our Stages, and then like 3 days later, the name changed.
Right. I mean, it's like, and Save Our Stages made sense because like more or less everybody that is covered by this grant program is somehow has something to do with the stage. So it made perfect sense. But no, we're Congress. We're going to change the name, make it Shuttered Venue, and completely, confuse everybody, which they have continued to do a really good job of. It seems like every week in a new and exciting way. So the twists and turns. I think someone asked me the first time I did a webinar on it, which was actually before it became law, right before Christmas. And someone followed up, was like, when do you think it'll open? I was like, oh, I'm sure that this will be up and running by Valentine's Day. No problem, right? Like March at the absolute latest, right? But the idea that it would be April 8th when it opened and then April 8th when it then, contracted again never even occurred to me.
Kind of crazy. So before we get to what happened April 8th last week, let's talk about the American Rescue Plan Act, because this passed in March and amended the Shuttered Venue, part of the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant, correct?
Right. A little bit. So there were a lot of bills that moved through in March. The big one was American Rescue Plan. And that added an additional $1.25 billion to shuttered venues. So that was really important. The bigger piece of ARP, of the American Rescue Plan, is that it put $350 billion out for state and local government. So really every single government, more or less, within the United States is going to get a very large sum of money that can be used for the arts. So I will say, as an aside, now is a good time to get to know your city councilors and county commissioners, because they are all getting, everybody is getting money. There's going to be a total of $9 billion in the state of North Carolina. 5.5 of that is going to go to the state. We're having conversations around that. But there's another $2 billion that goes to the 100 counties, and another $1.3 billion that goes to the city government. So that's the great thing about ARP. But then right after ARP, there was a similar piece of legislation that extended the deadline for the PPP to May 31st. And then also in the ARP, there was a piece of legislation that allowed you to get the PPP first and then apply for the shuttered venues. Because that was a real problem up until that point, is that you had to decide whether or not you were going to get a PPP or a shuttered venue, and you weren't sure whether or not you were going to get a shuttered venue, which would have, you would have been out of the PPP. So the only caveat is now you can apply for the PPP and get that first, but you just need to subtract that from what your SVOG award would be. So you're going to end up with the same amount of money regardless, though I'm encouraging folks to definitely apply for the PPP because in case you don't get an SVOG, you've at least got your PPP funding. And secondly, because there's still like $80 billion in PPP funding, and there's only $16 billion in SVOG funding. So it's better to go ahead and have everybody draw as much of that money from the PPP program now so that we can, so that hopefully that 16 billion will last. Obviously, if the money runs out, we will be continuing to have advocacy about accessing other federal dollars for the program, but still better to get the PPP first, no matter what.
Okay, so as if to specifically ruin your spring break vacation, timed perfectly. The SBA, the Small Business Association, was going to basically be distributing these Shuttered Venue Operator Grant monies. They had a webinar. They were going to open their portal on April 8th, which they did, and then they closed it. And to date, it's my understanding that no applications have been accepted, even in the short time that they were open. So what in the world happened?
So in the evening before the opening, there was a quickly released and then pulled back user guide. And the user guide is actually pretty well written, and it kind of walks you through step by step of what all the questions were going to be on the application and how you were going to need to be able to answer them. The problem is that there were some things within the application they were walking you through that raised a lot of alarm bells for a lot of people. The big one it was that so in order to be eligible for the grant, you need to have be able to show a 25% loss in 1 quarter of earned revenue, not total revenue, but earned revenue. And also your award amount is based off 45% of your 2019 earned revenue. So both eligibility for the entire program and your award are based on your earned revenue. Whereas your priority, right, there's 2 priority periods ahead of general eligibility. Both of those periods are based on your total revenue. So an application for this grant program would need to ask for both earned revenue and for total revenue. And the application that came out that evening only asked for total revenue and made it very clear that that was where they were going to be basing the entire determination off of. Because of donations, that basically was going to cut out a vast majority of nonprofits that had up until this point been completely eligible. And there were some other things that were a little worrisome about the wording. And we were hopeful that, okay, well, if you're asking a question, one question about paid performers and another question about paid staff, one would assume that since you've already said that you're allowed to community theaters can not pay performers but paid staff and still be eligible, that you could say I don't pay staff and not be kicked out of the application. That did not actually turn out to be the case. So there were lots of things like that that were alarm bells, and there were lots of emails flying around. I think it was about maybe 40 minutes to an hour before the portal itself launched, they released the new user guide that apparently they had been working on since midnight the night before, and after all their struggles had not changed a word, or at least not that I could find in the time frame. So there was a great fear that this was going to open and that the application was not actually going to be able to collect the information that it did or that it needed to in order to administer the grant. This, of course, got sidetracked because about 12:05, the portal opened. And of course, as many of these portals do when so many people are trying to get in them, it did not work properly. People were having a hard time getting in. A lot of folks that maybe didn't have something to scan a QR code on their phone were having trouble figuring out the verification. So there were a lot of barriers to getting the account set up. we were all of a sudden getting reports of some folks that said, oh no, I'm a community theater, I'm going to check no for paid performers, and they got a notification that said you are not eligible for this grant program, as well as a lot of questions being submitted, like, where do I enter my earned revenue? How can this be set up this way? In addition to that, the program itself simply was not accepting uploads. So, and obviously there's a ton of backup that's required by the SBA, tax forms, financials, ground plans, and a lot of other documentation. So uploading documents is a pretty major key part of this program. So by 4:30, the SBA had said enough was enough, and they shut it down and said that they had closed it due to technical difficulties. And then the memes began on Twitter, and I saw a lot of videos of train wrecks and comparisons to Hunger Games, and all of which felt very appropriate in the moment.
So has the SBA rolled out a new timeline for applications?
So they have not laid out a new timeline, but we are just within the last 24 to 48 hours. They're starting to do some briefings of key partners about what is going on. So what we know is they are not just going to open the application without telling anybody. They're telling us that they will announce it both via press release and Twitter. So, which I guess after the last 4 years, Twitter is now an official government announcement tool. So, so make sure that you're watching, the hashtag SVOG. And I think we're going to get at least 24 hours of notice, and that new user guide and new FAQs are going to be released around that same time as well. So we should have a solid 24 hours of notice and new information to process before we can go to SBA.gov and enter this application process again. We are also hearing there's a lot of confusion around a DUNS +4 number, and everybody got their DUNS number like they were supposed to, and didn't have a 4-digit. There was a lot of confusion. If you don't have a DUNS +4, then you just enter your DUNS and enter 0000, right? So there was a lot of these things that the SBA thought was obvious that only obviously were confusing. So we're also hearing that if you did start your application, any answer that you managed to get into the application process will be kept. However, if you did manage to upload any documents, those are clear now. So you're going to have to go through the document upload process again. And so it could be later this week, it could be next week. They have not, to my knowledge, giving any hint of a timeline, though obviously, given the fact that we were all sort of thinking that April 8th was a little late, April 15th, 16th, 17th, they are appreciating the fact that their timeline is tight.
Okay. So, and I guess, for folks in North Carolina, this would be a really good time to follow Arts North Carolina on social media, subscribe to the newsletter, make sure you're checking the website, because all of these announcements are coming from so many different places, but the one kind of clearinghouse that we can all rely on here in our state is Arts North Carolina. So be sure artsnc.org.
Yeah, absolutely. And sign up for my email list. I try and make those, I send out the emails anytime something happens. So that is, and I don't always get it out on social media, but I am always sending it out on the email. So that is the best way to stay informed. I try to put anything important in giant letters, and I do a lot of bold and caps. So just focus on the stuff that's bold and caps, and you'll be fine. Realizing that people don't always read my emails as carefully as I write them. But yeah, we're definitely working as best I can to make sure that all those sources of information are getting out as quickly as possible. And I'm usually getting updates out a little ahead of the SBA, depending on the topic.
Okay, good. And I rely on the Arts North Carolina website, so that's where I usually go first because I know that I'm not going to have to dig through a lot of navigation menus to find what I'm looking for. I can just usually find it all in one place. So um, when we spoke before, and again, this is kind of repetitive, but for people who may not have watched the interview we did before, who's eligible for this?
Sure.
Right.
So there's 6 categories of folks that are eligible. There are venue operators, right? So people who own live performing arts venues, as well as producers or promoters and performing arts organizations. So, so really not just people that own the theater. If you are a ballet company, if you are a theater company that puts up work, that produces work for other venues that you do not own, you are eligible for this grant. Opera companies, symphonies, etc. Additionally to that, movie theaters, not your giant AMC complexes, because you can't be publicly traded, you can't operate in more than 10 states, but really those small, independently owned movie houses that we
Like
see.
Rialto.
Exactly, like the Rialto in Raleigh, or what used to be the Manor Theater in Charlotte. I think they closed down, but we definitely, but these mom and pop type movie theaters. So in addition to movie theaters and performing arts museums, as long as they have a auditorium that has regular programming, at least 4 things programmed in the auditorium a month on average, and they have to have fixed seating. So there's some relief for many of our North Carolina museums, or museums across the country as well. Talent agents are able to get this as well, as long as roughly 70% of their, or 70% or over of their revenue comes from live performance. So if they are primarily talent agents for movie stars and TV actors, then they don't qualify, but particularly those live performance talent agents. I think that, who am I leaving out? The museum.
Music halls, like the Lincoln Theater.
And music, yeah, music halls falls under that live venue operator category as well. Theatrical producers, I think, is another one that they call out as something different, but it's basically, a theatrical producer is exactly what you think a theatrical producer is, someone who produces theater. And just depending on how your business is set up, there's different ways to approach the application. But yeah, really, pretty much anybody that's doing anything on a stage, as long as you have a clearly defined audience space and a clearly defined performance space, has a good shot of being eligible for this grant.
Now, I think when we spoke before, a lot of the nonprofits were not eligible for this grant, like your nonprofit arts organizations.
Right. So, I've had several groups that are not sure whether or not they're eligible for it. Community theaters being one, or volunteer choruses. Those groups that have specifically have volunteer performers, or exclusively volunteer performers, but yet might have a paid music director, or artistic director, executive director, costume staff, for all those production positions, development. There's a lot of community theaters that have paid staff, but volunteer performers, because performing is kind of the service that they provide, in addition to their audience members. Technically, early on in January and early February, the way we were reading the law, it looked like you needed to pay your performers. But SBA has put out guidance. I want to say it was mid-February, maybe around February 12th, that they put out an FAQ that said that if an organization if an organization doesn't pay performers, but as long as the people running the live performances are primarily paid for their services, then they would qualify. Now, I am hearing just in the last 24 to 48 hours, because the original application did not allow that, as we discussed, that those groups, the way that I'm hearing the phrasing of the fix is nonprofit organizations that don't pay performers but pay staff, if they have no cover charge or tickets, are eligible. Now, I'm not sure whether or not that's a requirement, or if that no cover charge is referring to another portion of the law, which did mention a caveat for nonprofits that don't charge tickets. So that is something that I'm going to be watching on the FAQs very closely when that comes out, is specifically whether or not we're going to see those community theaters, community chorus, and those other volunteer performer organizations, whether or not they're going to qualify. We've been fairly confident, based on all SBA guidance up to this point for the last 2 months, that community theaters and the like would be qualified, and so we're hoping that, and we're continuing this advocacy. I was working with Americans for the Arts, and we were having email conversations with folks at the Office for Disaster Assistance at the SBA on Wednesday night, and at 6 a.m. on Thursday morning last week. So we're having those communications, and then I've found wonderful partners in the North Carolina organization, the Small Business and Technology Development Center, is the sbtdc.org, and what they do is help small businesses navigate a wide variety of programs at the Small Business Administration and other things, and they have a whole team of folks that are working on not only interpreting this guidance, but coming up with, so they actually are receiving technical assistance training from the SBA that I don't have access to. They have an ability to communicate with the SBA. So if you've got a question, you can go to this website, sbtdc.org/ERFC, request counseling. And if you fill out the form and request direct counseling, you can talk with a counselor and get all of your questions answered. And if they can't get an answer, they're going to send it up the ladder to the SBA. And they might not be, the answer might show up in an FAQ a week later, as opposed to getting it directly. But that's that's another great partner that we've had. And it also has wonderful collaboration. I was on a webinar with them earlier today, where they were not only taking the questions and answering them of the folks, the arts folks that were on the webinar, but also the arts folks were throwing, it's like, oh, well, I saw this on the FAQ. And so there was like this great collaboration that was happening online between this team of counselors as well as the applicants. So I encourage everybody that's has got questions about this grant program, and we know there's a lot, to reach out to SBTDC.
And they also have webinars. You had given me another link to share of webinars that they have. So the webinar, for example, that you were on, is that going to be available tomorrow?
It should be available probably sometime by tomorrow afternoon. They said about 24 hours, and today's webinar was 1 o'clock. There's one from last week. And that was a crazy webinar, because it was really their first SVOG webinar, and they were also dealing with the fact that they'd had about an hour with 11 pages of new FAQs. So there was a whole lot of information and a whole lot of looking it up. But I feel like they're going to be continuing this series moving forward. This webinar today, they really broke down some specifics, not only about what we were hearing about what happened last week, but also venue-specific documentation that you're going to need. For example, if you own a venue, then you're going to need to upload in several places the exact same ground plan of that venue. But if you are a touring theater company, you need to upload a list of all the venues you go to. You do not need to track down contact every venue that you've gone to and upload a ground plan. Now, I imagine if you have a ground plan of the theater that you don't own, that you perform at all the time, certainly can't hurt. So that sort of minutia is what we're kind of getting down to, and making sure that the checklist matches the application, and that what we're putting into the application is going to meet the criteria.
Fantastic. So
Okay.
now,
I thought I'd
so I
gone
was
deaf.
going to unmute because in the world of my home office, they decided to do laundry upstairs, and you're not hearing the dryer go. So when we spoke last, you gave us a little bit of a history of NEVA, the National Independent Venue Association, and on their website, they talk about the NEVA Emergency Relief Fund, and they're actually accepting donations into that fund, which is under the umbrella of their fiscal sponsor, the Giving Back Fund. Can venues who are now stalled because the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant portal is closed, can those venues apply for NEVA emergency relief funds?
I'm not a NEVA expert, so I don't want to say unequivocally yes, though I would imagine so. I would say I know for a fact that NEVA is both for-profit and nonprofit venues. Now, the bulk of their membership, they were sort of formed by those for-profit music venues, so that's kind of what that movement grew out of. So there's an assumption that that is all they are. But I know that in North Carolina, they have, within the leadership, they've assigned someone specifically to work with government-owned and nonprofit venues, kind of through this process. So they do, and so I encourage anybody that is that owns a venue, and that is their criteria. A theater company that doesn't own a venue cannot become a NEVA member. But I encourage any venue owner or operator to become a NEVA member. It is free. It's a little bit of a complex form, as I understand it. But with their membership, they're sending out information about a wide variety of things. SVOG being one, and certainly other information as well, such as the grant program you referenced.
And on their website, they also have a call to action to send a note of thanks to your senators and representatives who banded together for the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant, and kind of echoing something you said at the beginning of this conversation, because North Carolina is going to get money from the new America Recovery
Rescue Plan, yeah.
Rescue Plan. There's a lot of plans to memorize.
Right. It's an alphabet soup.
Rescue Plan, and you kind of said that this is a good time to get to know your local officials.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, and I think it's funny. It's just kind of a crazy day. I started at the General Assembly with having a meeting with a senator, and then I had 3 meetings with congressional offices, and 2 of them, the one congressman and one congresswoman were on the call. And the message that I was taking to them was for PPP, for EIDL, for the NEA emergency funding, for Save Our Stages and Shuttered Venue Operating Grant, and for this wonderful ARP funding. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. But please also help us keep an eye on what's going on with the SVOG. And they're very understanding. And I do encourage folks, if you haven't done so, to take a few minutes, go to your senator, your U.S. senator, and your congressional House representative. Go to their website. It doesn't take long. Write them an email and say thank you, right? And it really doesn't take long, but it is so crucial to say thank you. And if you really want to, you can request a meeting. If you don't get to talk to your congressman, you might get to talk to one of their staff. So it's important that they hear that this is valued. I often say that every politician at every level of government, you can't thank them too much, because the vast majority of people that want to talk to an elected official want to complain about something. Here's a problem, and here's what I need you to do to fix my problem, and that is most of the communication. So it's when they're doing something good, like the CARES Act or the American Rescue Plan or the economic relief package from December, all of these things that are so vital to the survival of our industry. Even when there's challenges, like with the SBA opening, it's always so crucial to say thank you, and to remember that you have a lot of power to change how things work in your community by having that conversation at all levels, right? And a lot of times we focus on, oh, I'm going to talk to my congressman. Oh, I'm going to talk to I'm going to talk to those guys up in DC and tell them how to fix it. Well, you have anybody in the state, in any state in the union, has one House representative and 2 senators that represent their state. That is 3 folks out of 535 people it takes to get something done. Now, for in North Carolina, you have 1 senator and 1 House representative that are 2 people out of 170 people that it takes to get anything done. Your city council, there's what, 8? Right. So and understanding that city funding is often much more consequential in many communities, particularly in urban communities, than it is than the funding that you're getting from the federal government or funding that you're getting from the state government. So it is only common sense that folks should be thinking about advocacy as a multi-tiered conversation. Yes, you want to thank your congressman, but you might find yourself at a cocktail party or a weenie roast with your city councilman, and that's a great place to have a conversation and build relationships and make sure that they can find ways to invest in the arts. And like I said, now that they have millions of dollars, quite literally, to spend with. Specifically within that legislation, it lists funding organizations and businesses such as nonprofit to mitigate the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that is a use. Now, keep in mind that they have 4 years to spend that money. They also have the ability to spend that money on other things such as broadband, sewer, and water. And while we all need theater, we also all need our sewers and water system to work. And I think we all know how much we need broadband to work. So there's going to be investments there as well. But I'm telling everybody to start the conversation now and start coming up with a plan. If your town has $10 million, you probably aren't going to get 5 million of it. But maybe you could get 10,000 of it. Maybe you get 20,000 of it. And certainly larger cities are going to have hundreds of millions of dollars.
So on March 23rd, Governor Cooper signed his executive order, which increased capacity limits to performing arts venues to 50% of fire capacity, limited only by the ability to keep people 6 feet apart. Right. And I feel like with that news, we're inching closer to some of our live venues, particularly to maybe some of the smaller theaters reopening. I know North Carolina Theater has announced when their season will open, and so we're starting to see some movement. Will the reopening of our venues affect their application to the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant?
Absolutely. So it doesn't hurt you to open your venue. As a matter of fact, one of the requirements of to get the SVOG grant is that you have to either be reopened or have every intent to reopen. So you can't get an SVOG if you have gone out of business, which seems obvious, but you have to put these things in laws or people will try and get away with something. So it doesn't have any effect on your ability to get an SVOG grant, because really this is a percentage of your 2019 revenue to make up for all the revenue you lost in 2020 in the hopes that you will go out and reinvest and get your business started in 2021. So that is exactly what they want you to do. I think that it's really promising to see the progression. We had been advocating really since we entered phase 3 to get to that 30% mark. And so when we saw that at the end of February and that got announced, I was also kind of in the process of having the conversation with my contacts in the governor's office and at DHHS about 30% is great, but you understand as long as we're at 6 feet, we're 30% and 50% actually aren't all that different. But getting to 50% is going to allow some amount of flexibility there. So that 30% came out. We were really excited to see that because that was the most consequential change. And then like you said, last month we saw the shift that took us to 50%. But for anybody that's tried to seat 6 feet apart you're not fitting 50% of your audience in there. So even right now, if he got on a podium tomorrow and said 100%, but keep everybody 6 feet apart, you're never going to get to full capacity that way. So we're having this conversation now, and I think that the obvious next step is 3 feet apart. And so that's going to probably be where we go. And then this is one of 2 asks that we have of the current administration. One is to reduce the distance, which will help increase capacity. And we see that in the CDC guidance, but only for kids in school situations. So the CDC hasn't expanded it out. It is not likely that the governor is going to choose to get ahead of the CDC on guidance. He has that ability, but I don't see a huge likelihood for that. But we're continuing to ask him to do that, and the entire administration. The second thing that we're asking for is a plan, and we're starting to see this in many states where they're setting a target open date. That there's a series of steps of we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and some rough schedules. Now, of course, every step along the way, it's always based on case numbers and spread and all of those things that we definitely should base reopening on. And we have not seen that same sort of plan, and it just leaves us just struggling to, we get an announcement on a Tuesday or Wednesday for an executive order that takes place on Friday. So we'd like to be able to prepare and think through that as opposed to scrambling or having people wonder why we haven't just adopted all of the new rules. So we're hopeful to see a plan and maybe some reduction in the spacing restrictions.
Since we spoke last, Arts North Carolina hosted its annual Arts Day. So can you give me a little bit of a follow-up on that? And what was accomplished during that day?
So Arts Day is our annual conference every year. It is typically 2 days, though this year it was 3 days, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it did start off as 1 day. But on a regular year, the first day is the conference element, where we have generally over 200 folks come to Raleigh, and we've got some great speakers and performers. Some are for information, some are for inspiration. We talk a lot about the ask and what our agenda, what we're trying to get accomplished at the North Carolina General Assembly is. And then on day 2, we go over to the North Carolina General Assembly, and we have over 300 folks roaming the halls of the legislature, taking meetings with their elected representatives. And we set up a tent out on the lawn, and we have students come out and they perform like from 9 o'clock in the morning all the way through 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And there's food and ice cream, and it's great. Obviously, this year we had COVID, so we weren't able to have that great in-person connection. But we took our conference day and made that 2 afternoons worth of programming over Monday and Tuesday, with some advocacy training and some great speakers, some DEI training as well, addressing that. But we kind of approached it both as pandemic relief, reopening and recovery, and then also a real eye about the arts and social justice. And so that was really inspiring. We had almost 400 folks registered for that event, so kind of blew it off the charts. But the real important part of that day is those meetings with the General Assembly, and that happened. And some of those meetings happened before the official time that week. Some of them happened after, some of them happened during. But we were able to take 2 primary requests to the North Carolina General Assembly. One being arts education, that the General Assembly, as well as local governments and school boards, be encouraged to not cut the arts. Certainly with the ARP funding, there's not a need. The budget cuts should not have to be there. So not to cut the arts, not to take an unnecessary focus on remediating math and English and science, because yes, kids are behind, but taking the arts away from them is going to make them disengaged. We've shown time and time again that involvement in theater, involvement in music, involvement in dance, visual arts, these improve 100-point bump on SAT scores. They're more likely to graduate from high school. They're more likely to get college degrees. They're more likely to just be good citizens and good workers. So basically asking that they not steer all focus to remedial. But then our big ask was our Restart the Arts program. And this is something that we've developed in with the North Carolina Arts Council. And the ask is, and currently right now there's a bit of a surplus for a variety of reasons I won't get into, for one-time spending at the North Carolina General Assembly. And what we're asking, and this is separate from federal dollars, and what we're asking is in this year's budget, and really for the budget for the next 2 years, that they invest $4 million for each one of those 2 years. That's an $8 million total spend for Restart the Arts grants. And those grants would go through the North Carolina Arts Council specifically for expenses to get programming back up and running, whether or not that's marketing, that's contracts, that's rights and royalties. It might be staff. There's, obviously the grant program doesn't exist, so I can't tell you exactly how to apply and what's going to be allowed. But that idea that, we have used as a theater community, as an arts community, we have used up all of our resources just to not go out of business. So in order to get the lights back on in, August or September or October, whenever you're coming back, we're going to need a little help. And that's going to go for organizations, urban and rural. We are asking that this program guarantee 30% goes to rural and underserved communities such as BIPOC communities across the state, just to make sure that those funds are helping those organizations that might not have a 3-tiered development staff to write a really great grant proposal, because we want to make sure that we're equitably serving the entire state.
And the work of Arts North Carolina is ongoing. So even if you missed Arts Day, what are some of the things the public can do to support Arts North Carolina and help advocate for the arts?
Sure. Go to artsnc.org, and if you go to the Advocacy Center or the Action Center on the Advocacy clip down tab, there's you can select Action Center or just go to the COVID-19 page. There's a button to get the Action Center there. There's lots of different email alerts that you can, where the emails are already written for you, and you can just put in your name and address, and it'll figure out who you need to write to and give them a message. You want to edit that message, that's great. We're actually hopeful that that some of our arts leadership at the General Assembly is going to be filing a bill in the next week or two in support of the Restart the Arts grant. So we'll be launching a new campaign specifically in support of that bill. The bill probably won't actually get voted on as a bill. It's just kind of a placeholder to get plugged into the bigger budget later. So keep an eye out for that. Make sure that you are getting signed up to our email at artsnc.org, because that's where we're going to be putting out. Now is the time to email Congress. Now is the time to call your folks at the State House. And finally, get connected to your local arts council. Generally, it makes sense. They are the hub of the advocacy. That's not always the rule, but it is usually the rule. They have the 360-degree view of the arts in your community. They have an understanding of all those organizations. They probably already have some kind of relationship with city and county government. Help them. Ask what you can do to help them help you. And I will say this: the work is infectious. And I mean, obviously I like it because this is what I do for a living. But it's like, who doesn't like talking about what they love to do and why it's cool, right? Like, I mean, you just take a few of Nate's numbers and you sprinkle it in there, and then you ask for money at the end of that. And that's really what you're doing, is just talking. It's like, I do theater and it's awesome, and I help tons of people, and here's what it does for the economy. And oh, by the way, can we have a grant program to help it work, right? Like, that's what advocacy is. And there's this just wonderful feeling about having this conversation about somebody that actually might be able to make a difference, that you walk out, it's like, I just changed the world. And, maybe that doesn't happen like that, but, little steps, baby steps, right? And so the more of us that do that, and the more of us that get involved with that, the better off we're going to be. And, maybe you never come to my Arts Day and never help out with state and federal advocacy. That's fine, but go talk to city council, go talk to county commission, because you can make a real difference there. And I think it's really important to make sure that folks are thinking about that. And don't forget your school board. They're making important decisions as well.
Mhm. Well, it is always wonderful touching base with you. I wish the news wasn't quite so fluid, and we could just get on here and say, okay, the rollout was smooth and the monies are rolling in. But it is good to know that we have such a good advocacy organization in our state looking out for our arts organizations. And I just hope everyone will go on your website, sign up for your newsletter, sign up for your webinars, because you do have a lot of webinars throughout the year and special events. So our Arts NC should be on your bookmark tabs for sure. And thanks so much for hanging out with me today again. And I'm sure we're going to touch base again soon.
Right? Yeah. No, I'll see you next month. And but
I was going to say,
we'll talk about what a glorious success the SVOG has been. Hopefully, I got wood right here to knock on.
Yes.
And thank you for all you do, getting the word on this and so many other topics out, and keeping the conversation going, because I think that's that's an important part of not only advocacy, but let's face facts, our sanity. So thank you so much for what you do for all of us.
Well, thank you. I like being in the know, and I like having other people be in the know, because knowledge is power, and that's how we know what to do next. So thank you for all you do for us. And everyone, tonight at 7:30, I want you to hop over to Instagram. I know it's weird. We always do Facebook, but you're going to want to hop over to Instagram with me at 7:30. I'm going to be chatting with Katie from Broadway Sign Language, and it's going to be pretty she's a wonderful disability advocate. And so I cannot wait to talk to her about what she does. So anyway, thank you so much, Nate. And if you missed any part of this, you can watch it from the beginning as soon as we log off. And it'll also be on the website hopefully tomorrow. I'm able to get them up a little faster these days. So hopefully by tomorrow. And just take care. Schedule another vacation, because when you go away, that's when things happen. So
I'm going to Disney World in June, so be ready for big announcement in June. I don't know what it will be, but I'm sure I'll be dealing with it while waiting in line for Space Mountain.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Nate. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and I will see you tonight.